The man sitting across from me really does not need an introduction anymore. I believe everyone who studies or who tries to learn audio engineering on the internet has seen his face. He has had a magnificent career in music production, working with people such as Aerosmith, The Fray, James Blunt, Ace Frehley, and Korn, just to name a few. It is Mr. Warren Huart.
You're very kind, Mika. That's very, very nice. It's interesting. Some of the big names are really wonderful. Like doing an Aerosmith record was life-changing. It was 13 months of my life. Very exhausting, very emotional, and really overwhelming in many ways. Doing the second Fray record, it was 9 months. So when you mention those names, it's like lots of joy and memory, but lots of other memories come up of just like, it's a lot of work when you work with those kinds of levels of bands. But actually, both those bands in particular, because for Aerosmith, they were 10 years between albums. Anybody remember? It was like 10 years between albums, maybe even longer. Yeah. So it was it was Honkin' on Bobo, and then they did, Music from Another Dimension. And so there was so much pressure. And then with The Fray, it was their second album. And I think with what do they call that in America? Isn't it actually a German word? Sophomore? Yeah. Is that a German word?
I know they say it in America. I don't know about Germany.
Okay. Yeah, well, just because I just think of like that because kindergarten.
Kindergarten, Zeitgeist or stuff like that.
Yeah, they like a few choice German words. Yeah,
absolutely.
But anyway, so I'm sure these days. In fact, I suppose traditionally, second albums for bands are like what do they say that phrase is? It takes a lifetime to write your first album, and then 6 months to write your second album or whatever it is. The Beatles were famous for it, weren't they? John Lennon wrote Help because he was on the road permanently, do an album, then go and tour. And that Help Me If You Can, I'm Feeling Down. I do appreciate you being around. It's just about him living out in hotel rooms and not seeing his family or his friends. I mean, he was in a band with his friends, but just losing connection. Yeah. So both very high pressure records. Doing James Blunt was easy because it was just a hit song. They just came along and said, there's a demo of the song. We need you to re-record it. It was actually it was interesting because it was 3 days before the album went to pressing.
That's
3 days. And you'd think that would be more pressure. And in some ways it was, but it also wasn't because you had a time limit on it and you just had to do it. Where when you've got the Aerosmith or the Fray stuff where there's all these expectations and massive budgets, I think that's more stressful.
Yeah.
Because you're just, even though you don't, because both of those albums were 3 to 6 months over delivery day.
Yeah.
And they just took much longer than they were supposed to. And there was lots of expectations of hit songs and all that stuff. And luckily, they both did really well. Aerosmith album did okay. It was gold in a few countries, platinum in one, I think, in Canada and stuff. The Fray album did fantastically, and we had another huge hit with You Found Me. So it was it's worth it. But it is, when you mention those names, it's interesting. Those first two are just like, wow, those are really stressful. And then Ace Frehley. I've done 3 albums with Ace.
That's what I was going to ask you about.
Yeah, ask me about Ace.
How's Ace? How is it? I mean, I think you've, if I remember correctly, you've actually played on his last record, Origins, Part 2. Correct.
I played on Part 1 because I played all the rhythm guitars on Every Single Day I Wake Up, Fire and Water. On Fire and Water I played guitar on it. I don't know, actually, I've played guitar on all the records I worked on, but not like Ace plays guitar. I just would we would do like some rake stuff in the choruses, just for kind of stuff. I talk about this all the time as a producer, an engineer, and particularly as a mixer. A lot of your job is just to deliver and get really great results. And that means, if you play guitar and you just got to put some rakes on a chorus to lift the chorus, they not necessarily have to be that audible. They're just there to lift the impact of the chorus. If you have to do that, you have to do it. Yeah. And you're not taking away from an amazing artist like Ace Frehley. I'm not putting my personality in there. It's just clang. Yeah. Who cares? And the good thing about seasoned professionals, people like Ace who've made records for 40 plus years, is they don't even blink an eye. They just want the results.
Yeah.
He doesn't care. There's no ego involved. Like, oh, I could have played. He often would say to me, well, the first thing I did with him on the first record is I sang a background vocal, and on a good day I've got a fairly decent falsetto, and it needed to be a really high, I can't remember what the track was. It's on the first album. Anyway, it just needed a really high background. Yeah. So I just went in and did it. He went, I can't do it. You do it. And so I just go in there and do the line, and it's done. And I got a backing vocal credit. But I think my favorite thing was we did a cover, and this is probably you're thinking of an Origins one. I got to be honest, this is pretty awesome.
Oh, okay. I think I know what you're gonna.
I got to be honest. First of all, one of my favorite bands, which luckily as Germans you have impeccable taste in rock music. You all love, Motorhead and Thin Lizzy. America never really got Thin Lizzy. We could argue one of what the reasons may or may not have been in the 70s. That's a whole other speculation. But in Germany, they were huge. Motorhead were huge over here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember being a kid and going to see Motorhead and Thin Lizzy and hearing stories of like their two biggest markets were Britain and Germany, both those bands, which is fantastic to hear. So Emerald is one of my favorite Thin Lizzy tracks. It's kind of a bit Spinal Tap. Because it has that section. You remember in Spinal Tap where they have the Stonehenge that comes down, it's only this big, and it's all that harmony guitar part. I swear blind they are ripping on Emerald by Thin Lizzy, because it's that same, it's like this folky harmony part. Anyway, Ace, God love him, says to me, He's like, I don't have time to do that harmony guitar part. And he's not lazy. He's quite the opposite. When he first showed up at our studio, he comes in. I'm thinking to myself, well, who's engineering and producing and editing and doing this album? He turns up with a Mac and sets it up on my table, on my couch, behind the SSL, and starts editing the guitars and comping the vocal and all this stuff. And at that point, he was like 60, I don't know, 68, 67, 66, I don't know. Yeah. He was mid-60s. So he's a mid-60s, and he's running Pro Tools like somebody who knows how to do it. Not faffing around like somebody like that. And I'm just thinking to myself, he's kind of a badass. I think also, I don't know if you know this, I think maybe she died recently, but his mum was still alive at the time, and she was in her 90s. Mm-hmm. I think he's a lot younger in thing. I think he's got genetics where they all live like up to like 100, Yeah. So, but he was very sharp. I know he's like, he's Ace and he kind of talks like this, but actually in there is a very, very smart brain. Very, very smart brain. I mean, that's all the Kiss guys, isn't it? They're all really super smart. I mean, look at Gene. I mean, he's like the Bill Gates of metal. Let's be honest. He's the Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Jeff Bezos rolled into one. Yeah, he's a very smart businessman.
That's true. That's true. Well, while we're on the topic of you doing a whole lot of things, like you're kind of a
I want to finish up what I was going to say. So I did Emerald. I did the harmony guitar part.
I totally forgot.
I did the harmony guitar part, and then he says to me, Slash is coming down tomorrow to do the guitar solo at the end. I'm like, what? So the next day, Slash pulls up and plays a dueling. So Ace is sitting here, Slash is sitting there. Ace has got his guitar and his own, personal, his the Gibson custom shop, Ace Frehley model, and Slash doesn't turn up with a guitar. So I just reach over and hand him anybody a guitar player here? The Gibson BFG, which is one of the ugliest guitars ever made, but it sounds fantastic. And Slash. And Slash and Ace trade solos. So do like 8 bars with Ace, 8 bars with Slash, and they just trade solos backwards and forwards between them. And so then the album comes out, and it's got Emerald, one of my favorite songs by one of the greatest bands ever, Thin Lizzy, and it says guitars, Ace Frehley / Warren Huart.
That must be one of the best feelings as
it's pretty awesome,
guitar player and music producer.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. It's a culmination because Phil Lynott it's been many years since he died. I think he died in 83 or something, or quite a long time. I mean, a long time ago, 40 years ago, give or take a year. I could be wrong with the year, but or maybe 85. But my point is like a long time ago, and he doesn't get talked about enough. He was an incredible songwriter, great vocalist, great bass player, you know, and Thin Lizzy were one of the greatest bands of all time. And it was nice. Ace chose all those songs himself, so obviously he has great taste.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously he does.
It could be German.
Who knows? What I was going to ask you about, like, you're really you're very multifunctional in the studio. Let's call it that. What would you say is the most important quality of a music producer?
Put the artist first.
Okay, so it's like the psychological stuff, the how you treat people, like in general.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I've heard that a lot. I think one of the things we have to be careful of, I think is really important. We have to be very careful of is like not to overplay that phrase, like it's all about psychology. Because then it becomes very contrived. And I don't think when you're in a studio and you're producing an artist, do you sit there and go, well, if I say this and this, this and this and this, that doesn't work. You're with an artist, and they're not all crazily emotional, creative, nutty animals. Some of them are very structured. You know, I know Dave Jordan was telling me about when he did Americana with the Offspring. Dexter is obviously incredibly talented, but he's a pilot. He's a pilot. He's really, really smart. And so he approaches it like a businessman. He comes in and he's like I like this and I want to do that. So it's not always, and so he takes direction really well because he wants to be great. When we cut that song with James Blunt, James took the best direction ever. And of course with James, he has a really, really crazy vibrato. We all know, they're beautiful. It's got this really thick vibrato. And what do? You pretend that he doesn't? And do you skirt around it? And then what happens is you're sort of in awe of the artist. And if you do that, you end up really, not really helping the artist.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to just be honest with them. So I think the psychology thing is a good word, but I also think it sounds a little bit too deliberate and contrived. I think the best thing you can do, and I've said this many times, especially when people say to me, what's the best way to get a... Woohoo, thank you. Yeah. Mika, they loved your question. They loved your question. You're a genius. The best thing you can do is to make it kind of light. When an artist is struggling with a vocal and then not getting the timing or the pitch or the whatever, it's usually because they're thinking too much about the timing and the pitch. So if you can just take them out of the zone and get back to a place where maybe they felt free to write the song. And it's not about like going, hey man, do you remember when you wrote the song? What's it about? It can kind of work, but typically speaking, making it light, being a little irreverent and silly and whatever. Like, I'm stupid when I do vocals. I'll do all the stupid, I'll even make fun of myself. I'll be like, let's do one more for the kids, and that's just like, that's such a cheesy, silly thing to say. But it becomes like, that guy's an idiot.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, don't be afraid to be, make a bit of a fool of yourself. You don't have to be cool, bruh. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, I watched some really great footage of the XTC Oranges and Lemons session, which you can find online. And it's Paul Fox who's producing it. It's awesome. It's just like, it's like a bunch of British guys being very matter-of-fact. Queen, have you seen any of the Queen stuff? It's not like, hey man, I want to do another line. It's not like that at all. It's like, oh, that worked out really well. I like that. I think maybe if we try and do that, and just, like, oh yeah, that's great. Everybody's free to express themselves. The atmosphere is relaxed, That's much better than trying to be like deep psychological, Oh my God. Mika, what were you trying to say on that lyric, man? It's like there can be a component to that. Don't get me wrong. I have a few stories I love relating with Jeff Beck. There's the Jeff Beck story. I don't remember what it is, but it's the Roger Waters album. It's one of those. What's the name of the track? What God Wants or whatever. It's the solo on it is unfreaking believable. Anybody remember Jeff Beck? Is it What God Wants? The Roger Waters track. The solo on it is ridiculous. It's like, you get guitar players, like especially the shredder guys, they're like, I don't get Jeff Beck. I don't know why you think he's amazing. You play him that song, they're like, oh shit.
Oh yeah.
Because it's just like, he would just pull a note from nowhere, and he had a couple of riffs, but like two. He had like two riffs that he would go there. Own it, own it. Oh. He kind of did that Chuck Berry thing. He does it on Cosimo's Lovers a few times. He's got a couple of those moments where you're like, you know, that's a Jeff Beckism. That's what Jeff Beck does. But most of the time, it just always seems to be like, you know, God, brain, heart, whatever it is coming through straight to fingers. You know, it always just seems like just, I would never, when I listen to Jeff Beck, I'm like, I never would have thought of that. I never would have thought of that. And, you know, so that solo, I was told by a good friend of Jeff's, I never asked him when I met him, I should have, but that Roger was just, you know, Roger had Dave Gilmour, he had, you know, he had all of these different, Snowy White came in and played on the wall, I'm sure you knew that, another ex-Thin Lizzy guitar player, you know, with Gary Moore and Brian Robertson, I mean, God, they want to talk about Thin Lizzy and great guitar players, so many of them. But anyway, so apparently the solo just wasn't to Roger's liking, it wasn't getting there. And the story goes, I don't know how true this is, this came from one of Jeff's friends, that he completely humiliated him. It was just like, call yourself bloody best guitar player in the world, you know, or you're over it. Whatever, humiliated him, and it just, maybe it got him angry, I don't know. But that's one story I've heard, if it's correct, and it might not be. Roger might go, you're talking absolute crap, but that's the story I heard. And so I have heard of instances where maybe you threaten. Bob Ezrin told me this, that on the Wall record, maybe I wasn't supposed to tell this, but I've already opened it up. On the Wall, Dave had Comfortably Numb, the chorus only. And it wasn't, you know, I have become comfortably numb. It was sort of a baby, baby, I love you kind of thing. Sorry, Dave, I'm paraphrasing. but it was a very generic kind of lyric.
Yeah, I see.
And not necessarily bad, but generic, and not a Roger Waters lyric, which we all know. You know,
yeah, definitely.
You know, there is no pain you are receiving. You know, distant ship on the horizon. You know, the lyrics to that song are insane, and that whole album. You know, tight as a tourniquet, dry as a funeral drum.
Jesus.
Yeah. My hairs are standing on end thinking about it. You know, just lyrically an absolute masterpiece. The story goes, Bob said, he said that he said, this is a hit song. Roger, this is a hit song. And Roger, of course, the lyrics weren't that good, and it was just a chorus. And he's like, it's not a hit song, you know. And he kind of, you know, whatever, you know, kind of dismissive of this masterpiece of a chorus that David Gilmour had written. And so he says, well, if you know, if it's too much of a challenge for you, or something like that, you know, kind of goaded him into going to write the lyrics. And he said that he stormed out, like really pissed off, because he'd be like, well, if you don't think you can write a better lyric, you know, Bob's Canadian, by the way. I just don't know how to do it in a Canadian accent. I didn't want to go, you know, and ruin it. But anyway, so Bob, you know, said, if you don't think you can do it, Roger storms out. And he said, I think he said it was like 3 days later, he comes in and he like throws the lyrics at him, like, this is your bloody lyrics. Like
I can totally envision him doing that.
And Bob, and when Bob told me the story, it was, my hairs are standing on end, because he's like holding the imaginary lyric like this, reading it back to me, and I'm standing there just feeling like what it must have been like to read the first verse of Comfortably Numb.
Wow.
You know, you get teary-eyed thinking about things like that. You know,
absolutely.
There's very few things, and we know, we work in music, we work in art, but you know, there's lots of great music out there, but there's very few things that are just like spine-tinglingly the greatest. You know, it's not going to get much better than that. You know, Hey Jude, Comfortably Numb. You know, I mean, we could put a top 10 list of songs, and it's in there. You know, for rock at least. You know, don't get me wrong. You know, jazz and blues has got many, many more. But anyway, so I do believe there is to answer your question, there is a certain level of psychology. But I think with Bob Ezrin, who obviously the proof of the pudding is in the eating, he has so many incredible albums that he's made. The Wall is up there as one of the best albums of all time. That obviously there's a ton of psychology in there. I hear he's a taskmaster to work with. Jack Douglas, who's a good friend of ours, you know, engineered underneath them, got his big break because I think it was an Alice Cooper record or a Cheap Trick. I don't remember. I'm blanking. Sorry, Jack, but Bob was busy doing a different record, and he said to Jack, hey, do this band. And that was like one of Jack Douglas's first big breaks. And he just said he's the taskmaster. He works people hard. When they did the Hollywood Vampires, you know, that band they had, I think it's still going, he came down to rehearsals and he just made it's like superstars like Duff McKagan from Guns N' Roses is playing bass. Johnny Depp is playing rhythm guitar. Joe Perry is playing lead guitar. Alice Cooper's singing. I mean, here's a band, and he's working them like they're a bunch of teenagers who've never played before.
Yeah, that's whatever. I heard when he produced Destroyer by Kiss, that he was like running after them with a whistle, when they didn't, deliver. So that's
I think it's horses for courses. I use that phrase a lot, but it really is horses for courses now. With those guys, obviously, they needed it, and I imagine musicians with a long history and legacy of recording will probably look back at those days and realize that their egos were probably completely out of control. They were huge rock stars, and they just would flick their fingers and they'd be like, oh, I want a Ferrari and blah, blah, blah. Give me some cocaine or whatever. I get it. So a great producer is probably balancing the way they treat the artist on the situation. So it definitely is the psychology of it. I'm just always a little bit wary of that word, because no great producer is going to make the world's greatest therapist. Yeah. It's not about that. They just understand within the parameters of what they do how to get the best out of it. To make a producer somebody that spent 7 years at college, it's not that. It's just understanding the parameters and how to get a great performance out of an artist, how to make them feel at ease when you need to make them feel at ease, etc. It's a finite thing. And as Dave Jordan told me, as you can tell, it's like I'm driven by people who are much smarter than me. As Dave Jordan said, sometimes it's about rewriting the song, changing the arrangement, changing the tempo, changing the genre. And other times it's just about getting out of the way of the artist and help them make a great recording. Yeah. So the skill set is knowing when to take your skills and apply them, and when to get the heck out of the way, or when to use bits of your skills. I think one of the things that many of us, and myself included at times, forget is just because we know how to do something doesn't mean we need to do it.
Yeah.
Just because you know how to make drums sound tighter, bigger, wider, whatever, maybe the song doesn't need for it to be tighter, bigger, wider, whatever it might be. You don't want to apply your one thing. I think one of the things we've complained about, and I hated on the late 90s and early 2000s, like when Pro Tooling became very, very consistent. You remember there was like all these emo rock records, and like every single song sounded the same.
Yes.
The same drum sound on every single thing. The same guitar sound. There's like this factory of stuff, and you go back and listen to those records, and you're like, yeah, they're loud and percussive and concussive and all that stuff, but like, there's no, where's the classic kind of like every song has its own drum sound, has its own guitar sound, this one has a choir, this one has some strings, this one is total death metal. That isn't
recognizable noises within the different songs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's been an amazing answer. I'd say we have a few people here that I think are just dying to take. I was about to quote a Beatles song there, but does anyone want to ask Warren a question?
Please.
First up, heads up to a fellow Lizzie fan.
Good, yeah. Well, I saw the hair. I was thinking, and the age group, if you don't mind me saying, I'm like, he must have grown up as a Thin Lizzy fan.
Right.
Yeah. Good.
And by the way, he died in '86.
Was it that late?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I bought everything he ever did, everything he ever farted. I mean, I think the guy was as close to, one of the best frontmen that ever lived, and I did get to see him.
Right.
It was
Me
pretty
too.
amazing. Yeah.
In 1981. That's way back.
I think it was 80. That's why I think, for some reason, I thought he died just after I saw him, because I saw him in 83. I would have been 15 or 16.
Okay.
I mean, 7 or 8.
Okay. Now, here's a little bit off-topic question. My hearing is impaired on the right ear between, I would say, 1,000 and 2,000 hertz.
Okay.
And I was thinking of having a hearing aid to level that out to,
How badly is it impaired before we go any further? How many dB down?
Minus 50.
Okay, so it's quite massive.
Okay. And
would a hearing aid? I mean, have you spoken to an audiologist? Have you actually spoken to?
Not yet, but I was thinking of having hearing aids to do better mixings. And I was talking to somebody, and he said I shouldn't go that route and rather use reference tapes, and it'll be all good, I'm
inclined to sort of agree with that, to be honest. especially if you've got one ear with destructive stuff going on at 1 to 2K, and then your other ear presumably is fine in that area.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. I mean, I've worked with. I think Paul is vocal about this. I'm sure he is. Paul Gilbert. You know where I'm going. You know he can only hear out of one ear.
Uh-huh.
So I knew he was vocal about it. So I did an album with him a bazillion years ago. Firstly, the most humble musician that ever lived and ever walked the planet. I worked with him for a few days on one of his records. And I did some punches in, I did some editing, I did some rough mixes. Maybe one of the mixes was finished or used, I have no idea. But I just did peripheral stuff. He did 99.9% of the record, and I just came in and helped him. He puts out the album. It's produced by Paul Gilbert, co-produced by... He gave me a co-production credit for my few days' work because I was the only other person that helped him. And this was 20 years ago. But I was doing some records. I was doing okay. But to get like a Paul Gilbert credit, where he gives you a co-production and engineering credit, which he did not have to do because I didn't do co-producing. I didn't co-produce nothing. All I did was give him some advice. Maybe he felt like it was production because I was the only other person. But in the great scheme of things, as an engineer, I've sat in on sessions and freaking rewritten songs and not been given any kind of credit. So for what he did was wonderful. But So when he would do mixes, I would sit with him and he would turn his head and listen with his good ear. And then he would ask me, how's the panning? How's this? How's that? Because he couldn't hear that stuff. And maybe that's why he valued my opinion. But at the end of the day, I don't remember going, oh, Paul, it doesn't work. It's this and that. I mean, the tweaks I did with him weren't, they weren't life-changing. They may have made it better. But with his one good ear, he made amazing sounding records and continues to this day. So I think that's a good kind of story. I've heard a lot of people talk about this. I know a lot of people suffer from hearing damage in our industry. Some really, really bad. I mean, working with Aerosmith, a lot of the guys could not really hear much above the frequency you got dipped. They couldn't hear anything above 2K. So that's not unusual for touring musicians, especially in the 70s when they had massive wedges smashing them and side fills, no in-ears, no nothing. And just like, and guitar players used the amplification off the stage to fill the arena, So, Joe, Stephen would tell me there was Joe with 4 Marshall stacks or something like that, all probably pinned. So can you imagine, the kind of the hearing damage that those guys would have suffered? It was all part of the rock and roll kind of attitude and stuff like that. My point is like all of them are able to do their jobs admirably and they have got a lot of acquired knowledge. So your answer that you gave, that second option, isn't necessarily bad because if you've got a lot of reference mixes, you've also got good hearing in one ear, you should be able to know when something's great. So I suppose it's a tough one because I imagine, I'm not an expert in this at all, but I suppose my gut is, and the reason why you're asking is because there's a financial commitment to go down that road to get the one ear sorted out, which might be quite a lot of money. Because, the short answer, if money's not an option, is, I don't know, try it, see if it works. I mean, that's the obvious answer, isn't it? We're all probably thinking that. But if it's thousands and thousands of euros, then I mean, it's probably not something you necessarily want to do. I would say option 2 is a good start. Use a lot of reference mixes, go to a lot of different situations, use headphones, speakers in different rooms, earbuds, and listen and make sure that it works in every environment. And you're right, find incredible tracks that are incredibly well recorded and make sure that they translate into all the different situations and that you can hear they sound incredible everywhere. And then make sure the music you mix follows suit. Years and years ago, a mastering engineer, who was it? Can't remember. Anyway, he said to me, find 5-6 songs maximum that are unbelievably well recorded and mixed and use them as your reference point. You don't need to change them. Maybe you'll insert something new. What's that Bieber song that Joshua did? Despacito. How do you pronounce it? Despacito, sorry, yeah. My brain flight. Jason is in the room next door. That's quite a few people have put that into their playlist now because it's very modern, very loud, and very crunchy. But it is in a really great mix. But for me, it's like Woman in Chains for width and depth. Still probably one of the greatest mixes of all time. It has height because, and I talked to Bob Clearmountain about this, and it wasn't deliberate. It's just what he did and how he does it. But the way he uses effects and the way that he takes Yoletta Adams' vocal and uses kind of the high mids in a very unique way, really clear. Because it's coming out of typically what we'd imagine the top part of the speakers on the tweeter, you have Roland's voice, and then Yoletta comes in, and she seems to be sitting on top of him. And it's like pretty freaking amazing. And then the width on that song and the depth is insane. You can and he mixed all of those on a pair of NS10s. Not some ATC $70,000, PMC, Genelec speakers, vocals, whatever. Not on something like that, or they were mixed on a pair of what was probably $100 pair of speakers in those days. So that's a great one because it keeps you grounded. Because a lot of the time, I'm sure many of you experience this with mixing, you start compressing things. Like maybe you start with the drums, and you get them so loud and so pumping. And then you get the bass, and it's like, yeah, and you want it really even and pumping and a little bit of grit on there. And then you put this on, and then you put that on, and then you put this on. And before you know it, you've got a big square-wave blob of a really loud, very compressed, very limited, very exciting mix that you're digging, especially on headphones, because you can get really carried away with headphones. That directness can get quite exhausting. So you're doing all of that, and you think you've mixed the greatest thing ever in the history of the world, and then you put on Woman in Chains or something of that ilk, and you're like, then you go back to your mix, so you realize you have zero depth. Everything's like fighting to be the loudest thing at the front. And it's not that one thing's covering another. You might be hearing everything. It is quite possible to actually get a mix where the kick and the snare and the bass guitar has grit on it and the guitars are there and the vocals there and the backgrounds. You might be hearing everything, but the problem is you might be hearing it all at exactly the same time. So it's all like screaming 3 or 5K at you, clipping, limited, gritty, saturated. And that's fine, but really, you know what I mean? It's like, don't you want to kind of have some, depth going on in your mix? So I always love that mix because for me, that's what creates kind of depths, and it's a good reset. It's a really nice reset. But there's plenty of others, another old school one. And the problem with but the reality with these old school mixes that I'm talking about, the reality is with them, they don't have the low end that people expect anymore. So just be aware of that. They're really good for width and they're really good for depth, but you do need those modern mixes like Jason's mixes. You need them purely and simply to keep you focused on low end, if nothing else. And also volume, limiting, and just because they're mixed a bit more aggressively than stuff was done back then. So that to me is the balance. You want to have the Woman in Chains. Sledgehammer's another great one for just like dynamics and groove and feel. But again, doesn't quite have the low end that you want. But those two mixes are for the sort of older school ones. I like listening to 70s rock stuff because I enjoy that. I love prog. I'm a big prog head, love all that stuff. But it's tough when you go back and listen to some of that prog. The songs are amazing. The vocals are incredible. The performances are insane. I can listen to Genesis all day. But it does tend to sound a little old-fashioned by today's standards. I've had this discussion a lot of times, and it comes from Gavin Lurson told me this story, and I've used it a lot. For those of you that are Academy members, I know there's a few here, you've heard me tell this story 1,000 times. But he remastered the Dark Horse catalog, all of the George Harrison albums. And I think the first thing they did, but it was All Things Must Pass for obvious reasons. It's a triple album. It's one of the it's a massive selling, incredible record with huge songs on it. So he remasters it, and Olivia, George's wife, and son Danny come down and they play the record, in the mastering room through the big ATCs. Sounds amazing. And they get to the end, and George's wife says to Gavin, it's great, but it doesn't sound as good as I remember it. So can you imagine, like, oh my God, I've just taken George Harrison's legacy and I've not made it sound as good. after further examination and thinking about it and listening to music, what they realized is they just hadn't gone as aggressive as people do now. And I get it, you know, because Gavin and Rubin were trying to preserve the integrity of the original recording. So it actually sounds better than the original recordings. It does. They've got a little bit more low end, a little bit more high end. It's just limited a little bit more. So it was louder, it was bigger, it was wider, it was all the things. But she wasn't comparing it to listening to the vinyl on the way over. She was comparing it to the memory of 1973 or whatever it was when she first heard it. The memory of how it sounded compared to everything else of the time. So we have to be very, very careful when we're using reference tracks to know why you're referencing it. If I told you use Sledgehammer as a reference track, that would be great. But you'd send me the mix and I'd be like, where's all the low end? You know, so I choose those kinds of tracks based on what they're good for. Women in Chains for me is the perfect depth, width, height. Stops me from limit, crunch, 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 crunch. I get more and more, especially, like I said, with headphones on. There's a full frontal assault on both sides of your ears. You know, I want to get past that, and I want to make sure that I have all of those things, and that's the reset track. But, you know, Jason's mixes, they may not be the genre you're mixing, but they're a good way to hear boom and fizz, you know, low end and high end. It doesn't always have to be specifically genre specific, because if it kicks you out of your comfort zone, that's a good thing, you know? I think it's possible to mix a death metal track, for instance, and still use references that aren't death metal, because you want to make sure that you're not just... Now, don't get me wrong, if there is 10 of the biggest death metal or most successful death metal songs in the world, have them as references to make sure you're competing with them. But if you want to reset your brain, yeah, put on Women in Chains. Sorry to hear about the ear stuff.
How important would you say that location has been? And do you think that that's still a factor that we should consider as people trying to get into the industry?
That's a great question, and I've got to tell you, it's one of the top 10 questions I get asked. Actually, maybe even top 5 questions I get asked about location. I say these days, I'm probably not a great example, because when I went to Los Angeles, it was, well, I remember I landed on October the 15th, 1995. And I was probably your age when I landed. I'm guessing. I don't know how old you are, but probably close to your age. So, you know, I went there like, you know, band age, like playing in a band. Yeah, you know, we had a record deal and we went to America and all this kind of stuff. And so for me, I'm not a great example of it, but I think the world has changed completely. So I went there. There was not the center of the music industry. LA is not the center of the music industry. Maybe in the 60s, late 60s, the time of the Doors and the Beach Boys, and then in the 70s with the Eagles and all of the West Coast stuff, there probably was one of the main centers of the music industry. And then the 80s, you had all the big hair metal stuff. But by the mid-90s, it wasn't. There was a scene there, but it wasn't a scene that was like the top bands in the world. At that point, I'm sure you remember, early 90s through mid-90s was all Seattle. It was all grunge bands. And then at that point, there was a flip over in the mid-late 90s where it was like Lilith Fair. So it was Jewel was big at the time, Sarah McLachlan. Tracy Chapman had a hit a few years before, but there was that whole kind of scene of women artists that was also, you know, kind of pushing up and was getting featured really heavily, you know, in the charts, on MTV, on modern rock radio. That was actually kicking out. It was just before the second coming of like American metal. Because you remember all the metal stuff kind of disappeared for a bit. It was all grunge. And then like 99, 2000, everybody rediscovered Metallica. And then, you know, then suddenly like bands like Godsmack and Seven Dust and Discharge and, you know, all of these bands just came out of nowhere and just like dominated. You know, Limp Bizkit, you know, with like metal and rap mixed together and all that kind of stuff. So it was a kind of a lull period there. None of it was based around Los Angeles. So I'm giving you a long answer, but I went there, you know, to make a record and stayed. And it was a great place to go for the music industry as far as like going there to make albums, because people wanted to go where the sunshine was, you know. And of course, they wanted to make records at these famous studios like East West, United, and of course Sunset Sound, and many other great Capitol, all these great studios that were there. So all of that was of immense value. But at the same time, it had its pros and cons. What it was good for was playing in front of the labels, because the labels were, a lot of them were based in Santa Monica at the time. Most of them moved out there. I don't think Sony's there anymore. I don't think any of the labels are there anymore because the real estate's so expensive. But there was, all the labels were based in Santa Monica. You would showcase at about 7 or 8 because they wanted to finish work and then drive to watch you and then be home. And so there was, bands would fly in, and I had a studio there by the early 2000s, early mid-2000s, and we would do, I remember Wolfmother flew in and we showcased them there. They came from Australia, and they were being paid to showcase in New York, and what their manager did is he did an overnight in Los Angeles, and in that overnight, he snuck in a showcase for Capitol because it was based on the West Coast. So at that time, with the record industry still somewhat revolving around rock, not as massively it had in the mid-90s, but in that sort of early 2000s, there was definitely a reason to live there if you were a producer, an engineer, or an artist, because that's where the record labels were. So that was definitely a very powerful thing. Without a doubt, very, very powerful thing. However, it's changed quite dramatically. If you're doing, I don't know, I make a lot of assumptions. You have long hair. I presume you like rock music. Do you work in rock music? I'm making assumptions. You know, there's lots of people that have long hair that don't. Steve Aoki does, you know, dance music, and he has long hair. He's not a metal guy, you know. I'm just making an assumption. But my point is like, you know, LA for metal, I mean, if you've made a couple of million, maybe you go there to live a nice life and live on the beach. Like, well, 50 million, you know, to live on the beach or something in Malibu, I get it. But I think in a genre of like rock or metal or something like that, I don't think people are flocking to LA unless it's for a lifestyle thing. They're not going there to get recognized or recognition, I mean, you know, and to get signed. I don't think that exists anymore. So it's a very long answer, but the long answer really is like you need, and it's tough, but you do need to do all the crappy things that people tell you to do. You do need to build a good online presence. And even then, you have to do it real. You have to have a grassroots where you live. You need, and if you live, obviously, in a little village in Bavaria or something like that, that's probably not a smart thing. But if you moved into a major city where they have venues that you can play frequently, that's smart. But do you need to go to LA? Probably not, because if you went to LA with your band, if you're in a band or a producer, you're not going to be walking around with tons of metal guys. It's just, I don't know if you do metal, but rock or whatever. But you know what I mean? That you need to go to a place that has that scene. And that scene it exists in LA. Of course there's people that do that, but not like there would be in other places. Probably, to be honest, I mean, the best person to answer for that would be Christian. I don't know where he is. You know, Christian Cola, he's done like Aborted and tons of those metal bands. And he lives in a little village. And he's got a nice house in a little village and has a recording studio built into his house. And bands fly in and it's residential. And he makes albums with them. And it's in a little village. He doesn't live in Berlin or even Mannheim, or let alone Hamburg or Bonn or Munich or anything like that. You know what I mean? He's just really good at his trade, and people come to him. So it is definitely possible. It's definitely possible. Nothing's easy. You want to build a good online kind of community around your music, around your productions, around your songwriting, around your playing, whatever it might be. And you need to collaborate. You know, when Karsha and I went to, where was Capitol? Ohio? Columbus? Can't remember. It was a few months ago. We went and did a keynote there. And we talked to loads of schools. It was really good. Loads of really, like, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Some also, and recently we went to Indiana and spoke to Purdue University. Yeah, did a couple of classes there. We did a keynote and stuff. And the things that always come up when I'm talking to young people, you know, people that are still at high school, comprehensive, I don't know what it's called in Germany, but is is getting them to collaborate with each other. Because my personal story, even though none of my friends and I that I grew up with actually have ever made music together, with one exception, and that's Patch, I have a basis of friends that are a support group without ever needing to support each other. What I mean is, like, I could tell you one of my oldest friends in the world is Matt Butcher. Matt Butcher has been front of house for Blur and the Gorillaz since the beginning. And it's one of my best friends. My oldest friend in the world, Patch Hannon, is the drummer for the Sundays. And even though I've never recorded a Sundays album, I mean, these are people that I got from having relationships as a kid and also being in bands together. He and I were in a band called Star 69. We did an album, it's the album that took me over to America. He actually left the band to do the third Sundays record. And we had to get a new drummer, and we moved to America and hired a drummer. My point is, all of these experiences were bolstered by having really good relationships and really good friendships and collaborating with others. One of the big things that I see when people ask me questions is they'll say things like, I'll ask them, where are you based? They'll say they're in a local town in whatever country they're in. And I'll say, go find the best musicians in town and play shows with them. And they're like, oh, they suck, bro. Blah, blah, blah band. They're the biggest band in my town, but they suck. And I'm like, it's not going to help. It's not going to help you. You need to be opening for that band that you think sucks. And why do you think they suck? Why do they usually think the band sucks? Why does every metal musician think Black Veil Bride sucks? Come on, somebody be honest here. Black Veil Brides? Why do musicians always say they suck? Come on. Somebody be honest here. It's because they're a great band. They write great songs. They're very successful. But Andy, the singer, just happens to be like 6'2" and really super handsome, and all the girls like him. So all the dudes are like, yeah, they suck, bro. Yeah. It's just, it's pathetic. It's pathetic jealousy, and you see that. And I'm just like, dude, if I grew up with that guy and I had another metal, kind of modern metal band, I'd be banging down his door, being his best friend, to want to open for him and play with him. Instead, everybody's like, yeah, I'm not going to play with him. It's about collaborating and building relationships. And it's tough when we're young, but it can serve. Karsha and I, we just interviewed Brandi Carlile, who's a freaking genius. She just did a show in LA that we couldn't see because we were here. And she had, which is fine, but she had Joni Mitchell on stage with her. She had, who else was on stage? It was insane. It was like a list of like the who's who of the greatest singer-songwriters with her. It was like Brandi Carlile Presents at the Hollywood Bowl. Brandi came to my studio at, I don't know what age she was, 20 or whatever it was. And she had everybody fawning all over her. Rick Rubin was just like, you're a genius and all this kind of stuff. And everybody wanted to sign her. And she has in her band, I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, these guys that have been in her band, which are nicknamed the Twins, because they are twins. And I remember everybody at the time was like, she'd be really successful if she just like went in and wrote with all the writer-producers around town in LA, and they'd make her like a hit and all this kind of stuff. And you know what? Her journey was a little longer and slower. She resisted that. She has the same band. She's kept the same band. She's now like multi-Grammy winning producer. She has a song called The Story, which you've all probably heard or should hear, which is one of the best freaking vocal performances and that's uncompromising. So there's a level of uncompromising that's good, but make sure it comes from a good place, not one based in ego and like insecurity and all this kind of stuff. You can be uncompromising in your art and go through with it, but always make sure that you're making decisions at least as much as you can based on, what's the smartest thing to do. So I think for you, find the place to be for your genre and go there. If it happens to be a million miles away and it's unfeasible, it's okay. You can still figure out a way of getting in that scene by emailing them, interact with bands, artists, producers, and stuff like that. Send your music. The story I always tell. Oh, okay.
I think we're a little over our.
Oh, okay, yeah. Actually, I thought you said you wanted me to go long, so I was like, sure, that's no problem.
Well, that's fine as well. But we're like I think 22 minutes over our. So
Two questions, and
maybe.
It's like, yeah, I think just to sum up, I think ultimately, Ultimately, just reach out to those artists. Make yourself collaborate with people. Whatever it is, I don't know what you play, or what your role is, or a producer, or an engineer mix. Just do it. Offer to do some mixes for free if that's what you do. If you play guitar on other people's stuff. Collaborate. Create your own story.